Hello, and welcome to History Unraveled. Episode 0, The Suez Crisis Explored. On July 26, 1956, the British ambassador to Egypt, a man by the name Sir Humphrey Trevelyan, sent the following message to the British Foreign Office. To Mr. Selwyn Lloyd, in public speech at Alexandria tonight, Nasser announced that Egypt would build Aswan High Dam from her own resources. Funds would be obtained from operation of Suez Canal. Law nationalizing canal and expropriating canal company was approved by Cabinet this morning. Text as read out by Nasser follows. Police have just been posted round Canal Company's Cairo office. And with that fateful telegram, one of the most consequential and convoluted episodes of late British imperial history began. An episode of history that we now call the Suez Crisis. The Suez Crisis looms large in the narrative of British decolonization in the Middle East. As a whole, the crisis is a complicated mess of economic, diplomatic, and military pressures. These pressures first drove Egypt into nationalizing the canal, then would drive months of complicated and failed diplomacy, which would eventually lead to an ill-fated attempt by Britain, France, and Israel at seizing the Suez Canal. For the rest of this podcast, I will primarily be using information that I gathered from several major sources. The first is the wealth of information discussing the causes of the Suez Crisis and the motives and effects of the diplomats involved. Later on, I will use a translation of a diplomatic pact between France, Israel, and Britain, but my most important source is the formerly secret records of the British Foreign Office. These records are contained in a pair of books from 1956 and 1957 titled Further Correspondence Respecting Egypt. Now, these books contain a record of all telegrams, letters, and meeting notes from the British Foreign Services regarding Egypt during this time period. Each record has a date, a number, subject line, and summary, and all of which are compiled in chronological order. Using the information from these sources, I have put together a coherent narrative of the Suez Crisis. Most work discussing the Suez Crisis that is out there right now tends to focus on one specific influence or on the ramifications of the crisis as a whole. However, there is very little work which synthesizes all of these disparate influences and pressures into a single coherent narrative. Of those, many point fingers at Egypt or Britain, blaming it on specific singular causes like economics or the cold. However, I think that the evidence shows that while Egypt instigated the crisis, it was British and French colonial chauvinism that exacerbated tensions and would end up driving the crisis into an armed conflict. With this podcast, I seek to answer a pair of questions. The first is, why does it seem that armed conflict was inevitable, even despite the negotiations? And second, how does the colonial mindset and actions of Britain and France influence the situation and eventual escalation? Now, with those two questions in mind, we can finally jump into it. Part 1. A crash course in context. Now, to rewind the clock to nearly 90 years before the nationalization of the canal. In 1869, the Suez Canal was first completed by the French Suez Canal Company. From that point on, the canal was, and still is, a vital component of global navigation and trade. By 1888, the canal had gained such importance that a convention in Constantinople was called, resulting in an agreement by every major global power stating that the canal shall remain open to all nations in both times of war and peace. Notably to us, Egypt itself did not sign this convention. Instead, the Ottoman Empire agreed on their behalf, which is odd because just 6 years prior, in 1882, Egypt, and therefore the Suez Canal, fell under the colonial auspices of Britain. By 1922, Egypt managed to gain full independence from Britain as a kingdom, although that didn't totally negate the influence of the British Empire. Skipping ahead a few more decades, in 1952, the Young Officer movement, under first a man named Mohammed Naguib, and eventually, relevant to us, Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew the monarchy and declared Egypt to be a republic. Nasser himself was made president of Egypt in 1956, soon after which he began to plan the Aswan High Dam, an expensive and ambitious project. Nasser's plan was in fact so expensive that he had to seek external funding. First, he tried reaching out to the United States of America, who, with British counsel, rejected the proposed loan. After that, he reached out to the Soviet Union, who, surprisingly, turned him down as well. Now please bear with me as I get sidetracked into a tangent that, while at first it might not seem relevant at all, I promise, is very important. 5 years prior to the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal, the Iranian government, under Mohammad Mossadegh, attempted something very similar to what Nasser would eventually do when he nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or AIOC, in an event that is now called the Abadan Crisis. At the time, the AIOC controlled Britain's single largest overseas asset, which, along with the rest of the AIOC, was seized by Mossadegh's government. Immediately following the nationalization by Mossadegh, the West was forced to pull out of Iran for a time. Eventually, after failing to negotiate the return of the AIOC, they would successfully destabilize and overthrow Mossadegh's government, allowing for the AIOC to return to British control. Now, everyone would take different lessons from this event. On one hand, Nasser and the Egyptians would see that swift and decisive action is required, and that if they can play out the time, the chances of the West getting their possessions back gets lower and lower and lower. On the other hand, the Abadan Crisis showed the imperial powers of Europe that they had to act aggressively and with force if they wanted to maintain control, and that if they approached the situation diplomatically, they might run out of time and lose their chance to successfully reclaim what they see as theirs. Now, I think this is a good time to stop and take a quick look at the broader geopolitical position of Egypt in 1956. Nasser's government sat in a precarious position between the forces of NATO and the USSR. Quickly upon his election as president, Nasser began to pursue a path of non-alignment between either global alliance, creating what we now call the non-aligned movement. His strategy was to court both sides while not committing to either. This middle ground did not really make him popular with either side, and when he did do something with either side, the other was not too pleased. Earlier in 1956, Nasser had arranged for Egypt to receive a large amount of guns and tanks from the Soviet Union, which in turn put NATO on edge. Later in 1956, as I mentioned earlier, both sides rejected Nasser's approach for funding. Now, with all parties watching on, nobody, except Nasser himself, could guess what would happen next. Part 2. The Nationalization. On July 26, 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser held a public speech at the Liberation Square in Alexandria, Egypt. In this speech, Nasser decried imperialist influence from the West, going step by step through every event and every diplomatic slight that Nasser considered an offense to Egypt. In doing so, he denounced many of the actions of Britain, the United States, and Israel. However, the most consequential part of the speech was his conclusion, where he read the entire text of the nationalization law. The law declaring the nationalization of the Suez Canal, as passed by Nasser's government, contained 6 articles. A summary of each follows. Article 1. The Suez Canal Company is nationalized by Egypt. All assets seized will be evaluated and compensation shall be paid to any shareholders of the Suez Company. Article 2. An independent body will henceforth be created to manage traffic in the Suez Canal under the final oversight of the President of the Republic of Egypt. Article 3. All funds held by the Suez Company in Egypt and abroad shall be frozen. Article 4. All present officials and workers will remain in the employ of the Suez Company unless expressly allowed to quit. Article 5. Anybody found to be circumventing Article 3 shall be punished by imprisonment and fine. Article 6. The law will be made public and will go into effect as soon as it is made public. As we can see, the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company by Nasser's government was sudden, total, and sweeping. With it, he seized the entirety of the company with no warning, the bill going into effect as soon as he finished reading it. I think that this was really designed to catch the Western controllers of the Suez Company totally flat-footed, unable to mount any sort of immediate reaction, and that's just what it did. However, it did have the consequence of pushing Britain into an immediately defensive stance, memories of the Abadan crisis likely still fresh within the British Foreign Office. The immediate reaction of the British Secretary of State, Selwyn Lloyd, was to reach out to the French and American ambassadors who were currently in England, along with other major politicians, so that he could invite them to an emergency ad hoc conference. In the meantime, Sir Humphrey Trevelyan was ordered to issue an official protest to Nasser, and I quote that protest here, against this arbitrary action which constitutes a serious threat to the freedom of navigation on a waterway of vital international importance. At 5 p.m. British Standard Time, only 2 days after the nationalization, 26 men from Britain, France, and America, a group of nations now called the Tripartite Powers, began a 3-day conference in London to discuss what they would do about the Egyptian nationalization of the canal. Part 3. Negotiations. Now we can get into the meat of things. The negotiations spanned months and made up the vast majority of consequential events that make up what we now consider the Suez Crisis. There were several London conferences, but this first one I'm going to call the ad hoc London Conference, given how thrown together and last minute it was. This initial ad hoc London conference was the first meeting in a long series of meetings which would put British and French colonial arrogance on full display. Even in these initial meetings, violence was proposed as a last resort if Britain and France were not to get their way. Through every step, the British Foreign Secretary would insist that the only way the British government would accept the outcome of the diplomatic talks was if they achieved what they considered to be a positive result. Again and again, they insisted that if a positive result was not reached, they would not be bound by any decision. The implication of this is that, if they did not get their way, the violence proposed as a last resort would become the only acceptable solution. I would like you to remember this, as it'll be a theme repeated ad nauseum up until the final escalation of the crisis. The ad hoc London conference would go on for 3 days, over which an initial groundwork for the tripartite powers' response to the nationalization of the Suez Canal was laid. The conference was dominated by the 3 most powerful men in attendance, men who would be instrumental through the rest of the crisis, including the British Foreign Secretary, Selwyn Lloyd, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Charles Pinot, and American Secretary of State, J. Foster Dulles. On the first day of the conference, Pinot and Selwyn Lloyd laid out the goals of their respective nations in seeking a resolution to the crisis, to ensure the fair treatment of the Suez Canal Company and to ensure full respect for the legitimate claims and interests of Egypt. Now, I want to draw your attention to the last of these, because I think it's where they begin to show their true intentions, as it clearly shows they only intend on respecting what they consider to be legitimate claims of Egypt, and clearly, they don't think any of Egypt's actions or claims up to this point are legitimate. Additionally, on this first day of meeting, before the American Secretary of State, J. Foster Dulles, had arrived, an American representative proposed that the 1888 Convention on the Suez Canal ought to be the basis for all future planning and negotiation, something which was unanimously agreed upon by the other attendants. Finally, it was also proposed that any payments to the now nationalized Suez Canal Company ought to be declared as being made under duress to emphasize the illegitimacy of Egypt's nationalization. Dulles himself arrived on the second day of the ad hoc conference. His positions would greatly influence the tripartite powers' attempts at diplomacy moving forwards. While he was clearly in support of the British and French, Dulles laid out some major additions to the agenda, making it clear that if the tripartite powers were to be diplomatically successful from that point forwards, then they would need to sway the rest of the world to be on their side. Controversially, this also included reaching out to the USSR. Dulles clearly stated that the tripartite powers would need 2/3 of a larger diplomatic conference to side with them if they wanted to get their way. With these additions, specifics would be decided on by the 26 men present, and the tripartite powers would begin arranging for a second, much larger, official London conference. The rest of the ad hoc London conference would be spent putting together the upcoming First London Conference. However, there were a few key moments when Dulles, Pinot, and Selwyn Lloyd gave glimpses towards their true stances and ulterior goals. Starting with Dulles, the first point that he made, and now I'm quoting him from the British Foreign Office's records. It was intolerable that the canal should be under the domination of any one country without any international control. Such a situation was even more unacceptable when that one country was Egypt. I see this as setting up a hypocritical tone, because as soon as Egypt nationalized the canal company, there was an issue with the canal company being under the majority control of one nation, when before Egypt had nationalized the canal, it had been mostly controlled by the British. Additionally, it was in the conclusion of this ad hoc conference when both the British and French delegations made it known that they would not consider themselves to be bound in any way to an unfavorable decision during the First London Conference, and that the French were prepared to take any measures that they judged appropriate. In the wake of the ad hoc London Conference, invitations to the upcoming First London Conference were sent to every signatory of the 1888 treaty. Of the many nations invited to the First London Conference, Egypt was one of the very few to decline. In their reply to the invitation, the Egyptian government goes point by point through said invitation, refuting and objecting to nearly every single claim and accusation made by those organizing the conference. The Egyptian government viewed the invitation as patronizing and outright false. As to them, it placed unreasonable amounts of culpability on the shoulders of the Egyptian government. I think that the most important takeaway from the Egyptian response was that they saw the British as seeking to use diplomatic pressure through this conference to force them into ceding the Suez Company and control of the canal to a new international organization, an outcome which would leave Egypt in a position essentially no different from where they had started. The invitation to the London Conference, coupled with the Egyptian government's response, continue to foreshadow the rest of the crisis, with the tripartite powers insisting that their way is the correct way and asserting their demands to Egypt, while Egypt unwaveringly refuses to negotiate on any of the tripartite powers' terms, and the tripartite powers, in turn, get more frustrated, and the cycle repeats. The results of the First London Conference continue this pattern. Held between August 15th and 24th, it involved the delegates from many nations. During the series of diplomatic meetings which constituted the conference, delegates discussed an official declaration to send to the Egyptian government as their collective stance. While in the end, 18 nations agreed to send the declaration, there was some tacit support for Egypt, or at least for the interests of the Egyptian government. By the end of the conference, the delegates had drafted a declaration which would, in turn, be negotiated with Egypt through a diplomatic mission, which would represent the 18 signatory nations. Throughout the records of the discussions held during the First London Conference, there are a small handful of details which are noteworthy. Representatives of the tripartite powers consistently denied that the Egyptians had the capability of running the canal smoothly, claiming that Egyptian control of the canal would lead to a slowdown in use and thus would violate the 1888 treaty. They also consistently dismiss any objections that the Egyptians might have, insisting that the proposed company control of the canal would not infringe on any Egyptian territorial sovereignty. To me, the stances of the tripartite powers and the discussions of the First London Conference read as incredibly arrogant and even more so incredibly dismissive. Attitudes that continue to reinforce the idea that the only result the tripartite powers would consider to be a positive outcome was if the Egyptians were to fully capitulate to their demands, with no room for negotiation for a better deal. To negotiate the First London Conference's official declaration, a diplomatic mission would be sent, henceforth called the Menzies Mission, named after Prime Minister Menzies of Australia, who was himself appointed to head the mission. The Menzies Mission met with virtually identical resistance to that of the initial invitation to the First London Conference. The mission's main proposals brought to Nasser were that the operation of the canal should be insulated from the influence of the politics of any nation, and that to enable this to be done there should be established, under international convention to which Egypt would be a part, a body charged with the operation, maintenance, and development of the canal. Nasser himself outright objected to the second portion of the proposal, declaring that it would, in substance, be a complete reversal of the July 26th nationalization. Nasser also objected that Egypt had never once challenged the 1888 decree, saying that Egypt had instead continued to allow the universal use of the canal, and that he did not intend on changing that fact. Menzies voiced the mission's objection, going into detail about how the 18 powers think that the Egyptians could not possibly manage to run the canal on their own, that the considered opinion of the mission was that the Egyptians possessed neither the skill nor the money to run the canal, and that they would not be able to fund the inevitable expansion of the canal, that the Egyptian administration would not be able to deal with any increased volume of ships in the canal, and that continued operation of the canal could not be assured if it was solely under the control of the Egyptian government. Menzies asserted that to be a truly international waterway as described in the 1888 convention, then there should be absolutely no politics in the Suez Canal, a point to which Nasser also objected on the grounds that, due to its location in Egypt, the Suez Canal is inherently tied to Egyptian politics, whether or not it is controlled by them. In the end, Menzies proposed that Egypt might have ownership over the canal itself, but not the canal company, acknowledging that Egypt alone would draw profit from the canal itself, essentially leasing the canal to the proposed International Suez Company. From these negotiations, Sir Humphrey Trevelyan identified what he saw as Nasser's strategy in a telegram to Selwyn Lloyd, that his tactics are to offer seeming concessions to the users while maintaining that ownership and management of the canal must solely be under Egypt. Trevelyan outright dismisses this as a position held solely to diminish the chance that military force is used, an attitude which begins to strike at the heart of the problem, that the British representatives could see no position in which Nasser might be willing to negotiate, that his refusal to totally capitulate to the proposed terms was nothing but a stalling tactic, and that the West thinks Nasser is going to use the canal as a tool for the Cold War, and that the British representatives have no interest in a true compromise, only getting their way. In the weeks following the Menzies mission, the tripartite powers began to plan their next move. They quickly agreed that this next move had to be another declaration, because if it took any other form, the Egyptians might seize upon it as an opportunity to negotiate for better terms in their favor, and in potentially negotiating, the Egyptians might sway more nations to their side, or at least to the side of compromise. Before the now reassembled delegates could begin to draft a declaration, they decided that as soon as the Egyptians refused said declaration, then they would immediately bring the crisis and their declaration, what they call a proposal, to the United Nations Security Council. The assembled diplomats then began to draft the very declaration they anticipated the Egyptians rejecting. It was titled, Declaration Providing for the Establishment of a Suez Canal Users Association, something I will henceforth be calling the SCUA. The SCUA would serve as a cooperative body for all the users of the Suez Canal to cooperatively control, such that the administration and operation of the Suez Canal would be under Suez control directly. All members of the SCUA would then appoint a representative to sit on a council, which would in turn establish an executive group to directly control the day-to-day runnings of the Suez Canal itself. Now you might be noticing that, to the Egyptians, this would probably hold all of the same issues as the old Suez Canal Company. It would stand as a foreign body controlling and administering what they saw as rightfully Egyptian territory. And in this, I do think that the Egyptians were right, and that the SCUA was kind of set up to fail. In creating this new proposal, the Western nations abandoned any concessions which the Menzies mission had proposed, and instead drafted this declaration, which was expected to be rejected, a declaration which didn't leave any room for easy negotiation, and a declaration which, if accepted, would constitute nearly a complete victory for the tripartite powers, and a return to what is essentially the status quo. By this point in the negotiations, international pressure to bring the crisis to the United Nations had begun to build. The British Foreign Office internally insisted that they were in the right, and that not all international disputes had to be brought to the UN, even issuing official statements for its diplomats to use in response to any criticism. In truth, the primary reason that the British government did not want to approach the UN was that they were certain that the USSR would veto any of their proposed motion. Despite the reluctance, the tripartite powers did begin to plot bringing the situation to the UN Security Council in a way that would be favorable to them. During this planning, a rift began to form between Dulles and other leading members of the tripartite powers, Selwyn Lloyd himself rejecting the more moderate and less interventionist approach proposed by Dulles. In the wake of fractures beginning to form between the United States and the rest of the tripartite powers, Selwyn Lloyd finally reached out to the UN, writing an informal letter to Secretary General of the UN, a man named Dag Hammarskjöld, a man who would quickly rise to major importance in the attempted resolution of this crisis. Hammarskjöld's response to Selwyn Lloyd about the Suez Crisis was impartial, promising that he would adhere to the letter of international law as set forth by the UN. On September 14th, Selwyn Lloyd announced that the tripartite powers would be holding a second London conference between September 19th and September 21st to discuss the actions which should next be taken, and to officially announce the SCUA to the rest of the 18 powers. Over the course of the Second London Conference, the 18 powers ratified the SCUA proposition and thus declared its official creation. The 18 nations in attendance generally fell in line with the proposals of the tripartite powers, declaring that the Egyptian government had rejected the proposals of the Menzies mission, and finally declaring that the outcomes of the conference were capable of, and now I'm quoting the Foreign Office records again, producing by peaceful means a solution which is in conformity with the principles of justice and international law as declared in Article 1 of the Charter of the United Nations. Once again, I want to draw your attention to how this is yet another example of the opposition to Egypt unilaterally declaring that they are in the right, declaring that a resolution, without any Egyptian input whatsoever, would be put into effect. I find it hard to see this as anything except provocation or blind arrogance, as the declaration is either being made to provoke Egypt into escalating the matter, or the declaration is being made out of a sense of sheer confidence that they will get their way, that there is no way that the Egyptians could react or counter it. When the declaration drafted by the Second London Conference was finally put to Egypt, Egypt rejected the assertions, refusing to counter-negotiate. Because of the Egyptian refusal, the crisis would be brought to the UN Security Council just as the tripartite powers had intended in the first place. Now, between the events of the Second London Conference and the beginning of the UN Security Council meeting, various members of the British Foreign Office met with several foreign diplomats to discuss their government's respective takes on the as-of-then current state of the crisis. A large portion of modern scholarship discussing the Suez Crisis homes in on how the other governments attempt to sway and influence the actions of the British government, and how they attempt to assist in resolving the crisis. So, I think now would be a good time to pause the narrative and take a look at these foreign influences so we can see how other nations around the world tried to resolve, influence, and help the crisis. Perhaps the most consistent voice in favor of negotiation and in opposition to both British, French, and Egyptian belligerents is that of the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. Only 8 years prior, India had gained its total independence from British colonial overlordship, and to this point had maintained cordial diplomatic ties with their former overlords. From the onset of the crisis, Nehru met with both the British government and also Nasser himself, attempting to find some common ground, or really anything he could work with to help prevent open conflict. Throughout the initial stages of the crisis, Nehru clearly wished to avoid a deadlock, even officially stating that India was passionately interested in averting a conflict. This attitude carried into the First London Conference, where Nehru tried to encourage the British government to negotiate, to avoid conflict, and to find a peaceful resolution. The pleas of Nehru continued in the wake of the first conference, through the second, and on September 15th, he issued a plea directly to the British Foreign Office. The letter reiterates Nehru's goal of avoiding conflict, and you can see his growing desperation at the end of this letter when he writes the line, "I hope that the situation will not further deteriorate, and that restraint will be exercised on all sides." Now, the British really would not heed any of Nehru's warnings, or listen to anything he had to say, totally disregarding his hope of avoiding conflict. Looking back on this, modern scholars have interpreted the diplomatic relations between Nehru and the British government as something of a failure, leading to nowhere, largely because of a combination of Indian diplomatic experience and British obstinance. While the British would appear to enter negotiations with the UN, they would eventually escalate the situation, clearly not listening to Nehru and not exercising restraint. Another major influence that, in the end, went nowhere was that of the Baghdad Pact, led by Pakistan, which exerted a similarly ineffectual influence to that of India. Throughout the entire crisis, much as India had, the representatives of the Baghdad Pact sought to avert conflict. However, rather than the middle ground taken by Nehru in India, they instead sought a more pro-British track Throughout the crisis, they vacillated between supporting the British and really just total non-intervention. This was largely because, at the time, the Baghdad Pact was quite economically reliant on Britain. If they opposed the British efforts, they would have likely suffered major economic consequences. And in the end, their middle ground path devolved into total non-interventionism, as none of their diplomatic approaches seemed to accomplish anything. Finally, as we have seen, up until this point the United States of America had largely been on the side of Britain and France, being the third member of the tripartite powers themselves. The American Secretary of State, Dooley, had even been the first one to initially propose the SCUA. However, in the lead-up to and the wake of the Second Conference, the conflict between Dooley and the rest of the tripartite powers began to grow. Dooley began to push for more negotiations and compromise. To him, and by extension to America, the crisis had been an outlet to flex their influence and had become an opportunity to blunt the influence of the USSR. However, as the situation developed, it became quite clear that he did not know the direction that the British or French intended to proceed, and that he was being left in the dark, a situation which not only put him on edge, but threatened the status quo of American foreign policy. In the wake of the Second London Conference, it became clear to him that, as he wrote in a letter I found quite shocking, to President Eisenhower himself, both Pinot and Lloyd said in effect that they did not believe there was any peaceful way of solution, and they argued that only the use of force against Nasser would restore Western prestige in Africa and the Middle East. With this new understanding of British and French positions, Dooley would begin to push much harder for negotiations and push much harder for a peaceful resolution. However, his new influence would come far too late to prevent any escalation. As we can now see, leading up to the UN Security Council meeting, any influences on the British that were seeking to mitigate the crisis were either inexperienced, uneasy, or delayed. The substance of the Security Council meeting only makes it clearer at this point that the British and French governments had shifted totally towards preparing an armed intervention. Both Pinot and Selwyn Lloyd used the meeting of the Security Council to not only justify their positions, but also to weaken any potential resolutions negotiated by Dag Hammarskjöld or the UN as a whole. Along with reiterating the purposes of the SCUA, they made 4 other major points. First, that emphasis should be put on fighting on the ground chosen by the Egyptians. Second, that the French were wary of any resolution negotiated by a non-Suez Canal user. Third, that the Egyptians had proposed no counteroffer, meaning that a show of force now might make them negotiate. And finally, that the French government would accept nothing less than the initial 18-power proposal set forth by the London conferences. Following the official meeting of the UN Security Council, Selwyn Lloyd held a less-than-official meeting with Hammarskjöld. In this meeting, Selwyn Lloyd reiterated that the 18-power proposal was key to what the British expected out of the negotiations, and finally, that Britain might be amenable to Hammarskjöld himself mediating negotiations between Egypt, the French, and the British. Now, following these discussions, negotiations were attempted between Selwyn Lloyd and the Egyptian foreign minister, a man by the name of Mahmoud Fawzi, and eventually with Pinot and other representatives in attendance, all of which were overseen by Dag Hammarskjöld. Throughout these negotiations, and those to follow, many on the side of the 18 powers would question Hammarskjöld's biases that seemed to them to be in favor of Egypt. However, modern scholars do look at his influence as being mostly impartial, or partially impartial, meaning that he accepted the nationalization of the canal as a given, and wanted to negotiate where to go from here, rather than undoing the nationalization as the 18 powers seemed to want to do. These negotiations would stall when Fawzi stated that the Egyptian government would refused to acknowledge the SCUA as having any sort of control over the operation of the Suez Canal. Following this, both sides would refuse to budge. After days of negotiating, Hammarskjöld put forth a proposal which, while supported by Fawzi, was not close enough to the 18-power proposal for the British or French to accede. Nearing the end of the negotiations, Selwyn Lloyd held another meeting with Hammarskjöld where he yet again argued for the position of the British Empire. On the other hand, Hammarskjöld sought to temper not just the British, but also the Egyptians, and to slow down British actions, things which Selwyn Lloyd himself admittedly contested. Once again, I find these negotiations within the UN to be another example of the British and French refusing anything less than their initial proposal, only further escalating the crisis. With the breakdown of negotiations through the UN, Pinot and Selwyn Lloyd continued to discuss the operations of the SCUA, to plan and to negotiate. By the 20th of October, Dulles realized that things would need to change if a conflict was to be avoided, and so he sent a letter discussing possibly giving up the SCUA in favor of more direct negotiations to Selwyn Lloyd. In response, Selwyn Lloyd completely refuted Dulles, asserting that the SCUA was necessary and that they needed to stand their ground against Egypt. While I usually like to avoid ascribing inevitability to any historical events really, I think at this point, escalation of the crisis was inevitable. I don't really see any evidence to possibly dispute that. However, what there is still a question. How would the British and French justify an act of force? With both the French and the British posturing against Egypt and refusing to negotiate for anything less than the SCUA and the 18-power proposal, they would not change their stance. Wouldn't accept anything other than exactly what they wanted, and the fact that their demands were a non-starter for Egypt made one of two things inevitable. The first is continued mutual refusal to negotiate until one side broke, which seemed extraordinarily unlikely. The second, much to the dismay of both the UN, the US, and Egypt, was an armed conflict, such that the British and French could impose their will or seize the canal in its entirety. Only time would tell which path would happen, and given the title of the next part, I think you'll find out quite soon. Part 4. Hostilities. To the surprise of basically everybody involved, the first move was not made by Britain, France, or Egypt, but rather by Israel. On October 29, 1956, the Israeli military marched into the Sinai Peninsula, finally escalating the crisis into an armed conflict. Their casus belli being that this was an act of self-defense, because the Egyptian military had been supposedly launching attacks across the border for some time. Now I'm going to give you a narrative of the armed conflict and the behind-the-scenes diplomatic talks that were happening at the same time, largely from the British Foreign Office's record, but also some of my information on the fighting comes from a book simply called The Suez Crisis. So we can have a glimpse at both sides of what's happening during the escalation of the conflict. On the next day, October 30th, a British diplomat issued an official demand to Egypt. The demands are as follows: that the government of Egypt is requested A. to stop all warlike action on land, sea, and air forthwith. B. to withdraw all Egyptian military forces to a distance of 10 miles from the canal. C. in order to guarantee freedom of transit through the canal by ships of all nations and in order to separate the belligerents, to accept the temporary occupation by Anglo-French forces of key positions at Port Said, Ismailia, and Suez. Port Said being the entrance to the Suez Canal. The British Foreign Office then issued a similar ultimatum to the Israeli government. In the wake of the demands issued by France and Britain, Nasser met personally with Trevelyan. In this meeting, Nasser said that the demands were being taken as an ultimatum by the British forces, and that he was surprised given that Israel had been the ones to initiate the conflict, so why were they issuing ultimatums to Egypt? Egypt, of course, outright rejected this ultimatum, additionally sending a complaint directly to the UN Security Council. Upon learning of the outbreak of hostilities in Egypt, the United States immediately issued demands to Israel to withdraw from Egypt, and further issued demands that any member of the UN were absolutely to not intervene in the conflict. On the evening of October 31st, just after the sun had set, France and Britain began to launch a coordinated strike against Port Said. By November 1st, an emergency session of the UN Council had commenced. In this session, the United States would push quickly for a ceasefire, which was supported by a wide array of UN members, including even the Soviet Union. On November 5th, British and French troops landed in Port Said directly and began to push Egyptian resistance out of the city with boots on ground. On that very same day, official ceasefire negotiations would pick up with full force. The British Foreign Office responded that they would continue operations in Egypt until both Egypt and Israel accepted the ceasefire. In their statement to the UN, they insisted that they are in the right and that their actions were justified. For the next 4 days, until November 9th, fighting would continue in Egypt, British and French forces having seized Port Said, although they continued to face fierce resistance in the city's outskirts. Israeli forces, on the other hand, had occupied almost the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula, having almost completely defeated the Egyptian military stationed in said peninsula. On November 9th, the Anglo-French invasion force would officially accept the ceasefire. While this would mean the end of open hostilities, the crisis would not end for several more weeks. It wasn't until late November when a UN expeditionary force would enter Port Said with the permission of all belligerent parties that the conflict would officially come to a close. On November 27th, a joint operation seeking to clear out the wreckages of ships in the mouth of the Suez Canal would finally commence, signifying a final end to hostilities. Part 5. Resolution. Now, with hostilities ceased and control of the canal returning to Egypt, the world looked on, stunned by the whirlwind of events. And, to be fair, it was rapid fire and almost totally unprecedented. The seemingly extraordinarily fast and abrupt intervention of the British and French forces and the seemingly out-of-nowhere attack initiated by Israel led to many accusing France and Britain of collusion with Israel, planning to use the Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula as justification for the Western powers to seize control of the canal. Now, of course, the British, French, and Israeli governments vehemently denied any collusion, any sort of pre-planning of this escalation. However, even with these official denials, many were suspicious. Now, with all that in mind, it does turn out that we have irrefutable proof that there was collusion between Israel, France, and Britain. Now, I was honestly quite startled to find that there was an official protocol signed by representatives of each of these three powers, which is publicly accessible. They signed it on October 24th, 1956, just 5 days before the Israeli invasion. The people who signed it were the French Foreign Minister Charles Pinot, a British ambassador named Patrick Dean, and the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. These three powerful men met together in the French city of Sèvres, leading to what the protocol is called, the Protocol of Sèvres. In this protocol, they plot, step by step, the invasion of the Sinai Peninsula, the intervention of Britain and France, and even word for word, write the ultimatum sent to Egypt. They go so far as to set specific timetables as when each and every step of this would happen. Now, with all this collusion in mind, I think it really is the final straw in the coffin of British colonial arrogance. It's made very clear that the British and French, at this point, had zero intention of negotiating with Egypt, and given how often and frequently they had left the door open for armed intervention, it leads one to believe that this might have been their intention the entire time. That, if you look at the Abadan crisis, refusal to directly intervene led to them losing control of the AIOC for several years, and only after complicated espionage did they manage to regain control. They might have seen a direct invasion of the Suez Canal as being the quickest and most effective way to regain control of such a major economic tool. The British and French really seem to have thought that they would simply be able to take what they wanted and that the world would let them. That because they were these old great powers of Europe, people wouldn't bat an eye or raise a hand to stop them. And, of course, they were wrong. Now, this isn't to say that there is no fault with the Egyptians, as throughout the vast majority of the crisis, they refused to engage in negotiations with the tripartite powers with the 18 powers. Nasser did accept the mission and negotiated somewhat with them, although not all that much, and near the end, Mahmoud Fawzi did nearly accept a proposal. It was the British and French who refused to accept this diplomacy. So, while Egypt was obstinate and didn't negotiate as much as they possibly could have, I don't think nearly as much of the fault lies with them as it does with the British. Now, to summarize, this entire crisis began because Egypt was denied a loan to build the Aswan High Dam. This denial happened at the advice of the British government. To fund the Aswan High Dam, Nasser then nationalized the Suez Canal, and from there, a long series of diplomatic negotiations between both Nasser, the French, and the British began. These demands would see the British assert their position. It would also see the Egyptians refuse to negotiate on any of the British terms. Finally, it would see Britain, France, and Israel colluding to invade Egypt and seize what they wanted, regardless of any negotiations. The actions of the British and French throughout the crisis, their insistence that they would not negotiate for anything less than their initial proposal, their refusal to accede to any Egyptian demands, the fact and the manner that they asserted the righteousness of their cause, and their continued escalation really show that the British and French had very little interest in negotiating and very little respect for the burgeoning Egyptian Republic. The correspondence contained within the British Foreign Office's records shows two empires past their prime, insisting that their ways were correct. The colonial chauvinism shown by the British government's refusal to negotiate with the Egyptians is the reason that the Suez Crisis ended with the Suez Canal remaining under Egypt. Now, after all of this, after however many minutes of listening to me talk about diplomacy and conflict and negotiations, you might ask yourself, so what? What was the reason for this? Why should I care? Well, I'll tell you. In the modern day, if anybody, including you at home listening to this, have heard about the Suez Crisis before, you probably only would have heard about the short invasion by Britain, France, and Israel, because boots on the ground gets way more attention because, well, simply put, it's dramatic and it's unexpected. You might have heard about the crisis explained away as just another Cold War conflict. I really hope to have shown you otherwise, that the vast majority of the crisis took place in offices and meeting rooms over telegrams and letters well before there were boots on the ground. In fact, I think that the negotiations leading up to the armed conflict are far more dramatic than the fighting itself. The Suez Crisis was the twilight of British and French colonialism in the Middle East. They sought to brute force their way into some modicum of influence. But by refusing to negotiate, by refusing any less than their own total victory, they made their downfall inevitable. Throughout the crisis, they accused Egypt of breaking the 1888 treaty again and again. Yet, the only real breach of the treaty came when the French and the British sent troops to Port Said and sunk ships in the mouth of the canal, thus blocking it and violating the treaty. If way back before the canal had been nationalized, the British government had not dissuaded the American government from giving Nasser a loan to build the Aswan High Dam, none of this would have even happened in the first place. And yet, the end result of the crisis was a military victory for the British and French, but a total diplomatic victory for the Egyptians. Diplomacy really is where the ground is set. Diplomacy is where the war could have been averted. Diplomacy has the potential to solve the problems, if only the sides were willing to listen to each other. So really, it's a story of listening. It's a story of taking each other seriously. If the British and French had listened to the Egyptians, if they hadn't assumed their own superiority, the whole crisis might not have even happened in the first place. Now, I haven't had time to get into a lot of the minutiae of the complex relations within the British cabinet itself, or between Dag Hammarskjöld and Selwyn Lloyd, both of which played key parts in this conflict, and I think are very interesting. Nor did I have time to discuss the media fallout back in Britain and France. Media fallout which would wind up toppling the conservative government of Great Britain, and would add to the collapse of the Fourth French Republic. If you're interested in reading about any more of that, or looking into any of my other sources, or even reading the Foreign Office records yourself, I will include links to them in the description. I'm Dooley, and this has been Episode 0, The Suez Crisis Explored. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time.